did we miss anything? You know what's interesting about the quote? The share the gospel at all times and if necessary use words. Mm-hmm. I didn't want to say, I kind of have a love-hate relationship with that quote.
I was reading an article that kind of had a hate relationship with it, and I'm like, I'm not a buyer of the hate on it.
Well, it's just, I do think that there is there's a proclamation that's required. There's a saying it out loud. Just as faith kicks off in our heart by confessing. Mm-hmm. So there is a saying it out loud. And the fear of that quote at times is people say, I'm a silent witness. And I don't think you can be. Mm-hmm. You have to stand up in the court of culture and testify to who Jesus is and what he's done in your life. At some point, you have to say it out loud.
Totally. And I would...
If you're just pointing, then you're just a snitch.
I would say
what a dumb metaphor.
That's why I kept moving on.
Yeah.
No, I'm just kidding. No. A lot of respect and honor to the Dr. Brian Jenkins.
Okay. No, you don't agree with that?
No, I do. No, I agree. I totally agree with.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
What I was gonna say was, just as the gospel message can be co-opted, the intent of that quote can be co-opted.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the intent is not to downplay the proclamation. At least I don't think it is. I think it's meant to upplay the don't simply proclamate with
just don't simply
proclaim with the absence of actions.
Deeds, you know? Like we had this in one of the towns I lived in, we had this street preacher that would come down to the square all the time, and he would preach the gospel as he saw it, but he's just not a nice guy, in his doing of it. So he was proclaiming, but he wasn't bearing witness, I guess, in that one. I wondered too, did we miss anything? I wondered too if we were ever going to get into because not in the conversations about how big should a church be, mega church versus small church or home church or local church or, So I caught you right in mid-grape, my bad. So I just think that's an interesting conversation because obviously we're a part of what would be considered a mega church. And so I think there are people, very well-meaning people, that would say that we're not actually being the church.
Ooh.
Yeah.
I don't like that idea.
Yeah.
Specifically because I feel like
By the way, I also think there are people in mega churches who would look at smaller home churches or smaller local churches and say they're not being the church either.
Insignificant.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Both again just missing the mark there, because we see in the very earliest expression of the church that 3,000 were saved, and hundreds or thousands were being added daily. Yeah. And so it was a very mega church at the. I think people's, if I can speak for the people's, real quickly, I think people's.
You're the people's champion.
Yeah, apparently. I think people's rub against mega churches is one, it being so big that they don't feel seen, right? And you want to feel seen in a community, right? You want to feel as if you have a connection with the people around you, and if you get kind of lost in the thing, also, if it's big, then it can have some sort of power or wealth associated with that, and that a lot of times gets demonized as well. And so, I think the bigness of a thing isn't bad. It can become bad, and I empathize with the way that's wielded against the mission of the church. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean we then therefore abandon the idea of Sunday gatherings in person. Mm-hmm. Because meeting in my living room with my friends is therefore this is the right way to do it. Mm-hmm. It's a way. And it's a great way. And a lot of churches start there, mm-hmm. right? And maybe they stay there, and that's the extent of what it is. Being a youth pastor for 17 years, I can find reasons why that kind of church doesn't help meeting that demographic.
The whole family's needs.
Yeah, the whole family's needs, not just the adults. Mm-hmm. But then you have children and teenagers, which they're looking for something they're looking for a community to themselves as well. So I don't know. I'm glad you brought this up because I hadn't thought about going there.
No, it's just interesting. I was watching a podcast with I don't know how namey we want to get, but it was a pastor of a pretty good sized famous church, and he has recently stepped down from the church. And one of the things that he says is, he says, I'm just not, because Sundays just don't impress me anymore.
Yeah.
And I'm not overwhelmed by Sunday, or I'm just not whelmed. It's something to that effect. But basically, like, the whole Sunday, and I don't know if he even meant that, but it kind of felt like I've moved beyond the need to be in a church on Sunday. And for his spiritual journey and what he's gone through, I don't doubt it. But I think that when leaders, like, I'm even trying to think of how careful I say something, because, of the 80 or 90 people who watch Did We Miss Anything? The literal dozens who engage in this content.
You need to stop that right
now,
young man.
There are dozens of us everywhere. I don't want to say something misinterpret, but I think that anytime any of us say this is the way the church should be done, we should all get like super, super nervous. Because there's no order of service in the Bible. There's no church planning guide in the Bible. There is only the fact that the church existed, and then a handful of the things that it said that they did.
Yeah. Which, by the way, that's beautiful, because it reflects creation, because creation's not all one way. It's not all one biome. It's not all, we don't all look the same way. We don't all act the same way. So there's going to be different expressions, and that's a beautiful mosaic. It's a beautiful expression of how, just, talking about like how the gospel, the seeds analogy, that things take note, is it notes of the region? Yeah,
they take the minerals and the tones and the notes.
Flavor exactly. So if you have a liturgical church, liturgical meaning like, there's this
fancy.
Is that?
No,
is that okay? I was about to say, it's like, is that what that meant? No. You got me on Soto earlier, so I thought I missed.
No, but ritual and high church.
And by the way, I came to faith through that expression, and so we were only there Christmas and Easter, right? But the pews and the folding down of the kneeling bench, and like, peace be with you and also with you, like all that kind of stuff. Like that was very. That's the order of service, and they would have reasons for why they would do it that way. They would have that, when they're preaching or giving the word, they do 4 different places. They do Old Testament, I think somewhere in the Proverbs,
from the wisdom,
or Psalms. Then there's the prophets, and then there's something from New Testament.
And everything's always
and there's a reason that they do it that way. Am I going to stand here on a podcast and say, that you shouldn't be doing it that way, and our denomination's growing and yours isn't?
Right.
Like, no, we're all different, and that's fine. Maybe there's better ways of doing it for engaging a specific culture or demographic or what have you, and we can have that discussion. But if we start saying God said, we must teach this way, or
well, it's interesting too, because if I think of in Dogmatics, Karl Barth, the theologian in the 20th century theologian, Karl Barth talks about that theology, or dogmatics. He calls it, we would call it theology, is sort of the bridge between this message that never changes and then the methods by which culture is. So he would actually argue that you need to find sort of relevant contemporary cultural expressions, because people say things like, I wish we were back in the first century church. And I'm like, actually, you kind of don't, unless you want to be meeting like in a cave with the Roman government coming after you.
You wouldn't have refrigeration.
You wouldn't have refrigeration. You wouldn't have the King James Bible or any the NIV. You wouldn't have the hymns that you love now. They didn't have. You wouldn't. I mean, we wouldn't hardly even recognize it. And people say, well, we need to get back to that. I would say, I don't know that we do, because even then, what we took away was, because even the meeting style of the first century church probably came from the synagogue. And what did they do?
Right.
They prayed, they sang, they studied God's word together, and they took up a collection. Okay. And
we're talking about the church, right? The early church.
This is the earliest church.
Century. Yeah, they did both the meeting in the synagogues on the Sabbath.
They just continued going to synagogue.
And they also met in homes. And so you see both.
Right.
And there's no elevation of one over the other.
No, and it's this sense of, and then when the Gentiles got involved, they were like, well, we're kind of busy during the day, so what if we moved it to this day? And Paul was like, who cares? Paul literally says, who cares?
Right.
Paul is driven. There's a really kind of some interesting things. Like there's even some interesting work that can be done, especially in Paul, of how outsider aware is your church culture. Because he'll make a couple of references, particularly in 1 Corinthians, about, the Greeks and the outsiders are paying attention to what you're doing. Are you having a church that allows them to understand what's going on? He talks about it with their legal disputes. He talks about it with their spiritual gifts. Mm-hmm. He talks about, again, that passage I read from 1 Kings in the temple dedication literally says, because our temple is so beautiful and awesome and amazing, people will find their way to God. Mm-hmm. So it's even like this tangible ministry presence will draw people here based on how we've done beauty and the art and the human aesthetic of this amazing thing. Right. So you have Paul saying, do you even care that people who are far from God are trying to pay attention to your faith? You have the contributors to the temple saying, we put our art and our culture and our effort into making this something that reflects our devotion to God. So there are these little pockets of incredibly unique diversity, even within how faith was expressed. And then I even think of, and I don't remember where it's at, but that passage where the disciples are like, hey, those guys over there are they're like preaching your message and they're casting demons out, but they don't run with us. And Jesus is like, who cares?
Yeah. Yeah. Paul does that too in Philippians.
Yeah. Like, who cares?
Yeah.
Who cares? Why are you, the good work's getting done? Yeah, he does. He does in Philippians. You're absolutely right. Because he says, no, the good work was getting done.
Yeah. That took me a while to grasp, to catch a hold of it. Because Paul says, some people do. I think it's in 1 or maybe the beginning of 2. He's saying that those who preach Christ out of selfish ambition or vain conceit do it for something, and so be it. Essentially, maybe bring it up would be the best way to.
Yeah. So he says, some indeed preach Christ even of envy and strife, and some also of goodwill.
What then?
The one preach Christ of contention, not sincerely, supposing to add affliction to my bonds, but the other of love, knowing that I'm set for the defense of the gospel. This is chapter 1, verse 18. What then? Notwithstanding, every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached. Therefore I do rejoice.
And that's, so, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a wild statement. So that's okay.
So all these podcasts or all these shows that where the guys are ripping somebody's preaching, or they're, hey, here's such and, there's one and they got the goofy look on their face and their little thumbnails like, ooh, that's really interesting to me. Sorry. Yeah, because Paul would kind of say, well, Christ's getting preached, so sorry you don't like it.
Christ is getting preached.
And therein I rejoice. That's what he says. Therein I rejoice.
Yeah.
That's really wild.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, the amount of guys who are critical of other pastors, but are in and of themselves preaching a form of salvation by works, which is a whole other gospel, that should be paid attention to. Because when we do that, we're saying if you don't preach the Bible exactly this way, if you don't dress this exact way, if you don't sing these exact songs, boom, 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 then you're not really a pastor, you're not really Christian. And now you've just made everything about this legal. You've made it some moralistic virtue.
Yeah.
There's that. So is a guy who some of these people, a handful of these guys who draw great criticism, are they preaching a heretical, unorthodox gospel? Boy, now that's a completely different discussion than are they weird, or do they dress strange, or do they...
Yeah, or even do they sin? Have they been caught up in a massive scandal?
Are they disqualified from public ministry because of their overt sin? Right.
And then that's that's a good, that's a fair question to say.
Yeah, it's a completely legitimate question.
But then we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. I think of people who maybe have been that received Jesus in a church context where it came out later that the founder or the pastor or whomever was caught up in some moral thing and big thing, right? And so, but that doesn't disqualify the message, right? Because the message is separate from from the messenger in this context.
In the sense of the yeah, I mean, Jesus is the one who saves them.
Right.